as I said, I teach at the University of Victoria, and my mandate is to teach modern art, and my specialty is anarchism in the arts. And so I find myself in the wonderful position of teaching the politics of anarchism through art. And it's easy to do because you don't have to go too far in the history of art to discover anarchists. Anarchism and the arts are integral. They really are integrated. There's been such a rich history of a dialogue between artists and anarchists, artists identified as anarchists, anarchists who may or may not be artists interested in the arts. Recognizing that the arts are a different kind of, the arts offer us ways of expanding our consciousness about the world, our capacities to express ourselves and communicate meaning. Meaning not only analytically, in your mind, so to speak, but also meaning through, touch, a visual impression, things like this, meaning through art that moves you, that touches your emotions, through music, poetry, the visual arts, performance, you name it. And so it's not it doesn't come as a surprise to me that anarchists have been drawn to the arts, recognizing the power of arts to communicate, to build empathy with others and understanding, and to radicalize people through that process. Because the arts are, in a way, a wonderful prefiguration of freedom. What could be more free than making a creative work? And there's nothing got in you other than what wells out of you, the impulse to create that's within you. And we all have that impulse. It's realized in different ways in our everyday lives, but the arts, it's a sphere that really affirms that and develops it. So, in the history of art and its connection with anarchism, we could begin with Proudhon and an artist that he wrote an entire book about, Gustave Courbet, a realist artist who identified as an anarchist and participated in the Paris Commune and was a wonderful painter and a critical thinker who in his own time undermined the academic style in art, which is very much focused on prototypes and symbols from Greece, Rome, academic art traditions. And he said, no, I'm going to be a realist, I'm going to paint what's around me. I'm going to integrate into my art the world that I'm part of. And so he did that and created a very powerful work which deals with the politics of the day, the world that he was a part of. And then moving on from there, we have a whole bunch of artists who formed a movement called they were called the Neo-Impressionists, out of Impressionist painting. Camille Pissarro was one of these artists who developed a technique of painting where they applied pure dots of pure color on the canvas to create these beautiful luminous images of the world around them. So they do landscapes and things like this using this technique. And they related their technique of painting to the politics of anarchist communism, to the ideas of Peter Kropotkin, the idea of the individuality of color and the way in which all these individual dots of color come together and form a harmonious aesthetic, being analogous to the ambitions of the anarchists to create a society that simultaneously affirmed individualism and also the social whole, the good of the social whole, and how the two could coexist. Individuality and freedom within a larger harmonious social order. And so they talked about their aesthetic as a kind of prefiguration of that social ambition in the realm of painting. You go forward to era of World War I, you have anarchists who are involved in a movement called the Dada movement, which is all about upending the values, the received values of what an artwork is understood to be. And they attack those preconceptions of what an artwork should be in order to undermine the social order, the cultural dimensions of the social order that they see as completely bankrupt and complicit with the cataclysm of World War I. So in New York City, a French artist, Marcel Duchamp, who left Paris in 1915 because he was, basically fleeing a country at war, comes to New York and gets involved in the art scene in New York. He's a sternest anarchist. Okay. Marcel Duchamp, when he comes to the United States, he comes up with this idea of the ready-made, which is, say this cup here, Duchamp says, if I say this is a work of art, it's a work of art, which demolishes the criteria that the critics, the collectors, the museums at that time held for what a work of art was. No, how can you say this is a work of art? You, the artist who's saying it's a work of art, didn't create it. It's a mass-produced object. I mean, there's thousands of these floating, maybe millions of these mugs floating around all over the place. So it has no origin in a creative act as such. You're declaring it a work of art. What you mean? So it was a very confusing wrench that Marcel Duchamp threw into the works of the understanding of art, but not only the understanding of art, but also its marketing. And he did this in the context of an exhibition that was organized by a number of modern artists in 1917 to promote modern art. The exhibition opened in April 1917, and the exhibitors decided to link the promotion of modern art and what they called creative freedom in art to American nationalism, because April 1917 is when the United States joins World War I. Marcel Duchamp was part of the organizing committee for this exhibition. He was a follower of Max Stirner, and an individualist anarchist, definitely not interested in propping up the state or war or associating modern art with American patriotism. So when the other organizers on the exhibition committee started talking about the exhibition as an example of American democracy in action, and isn't this what we're going to war to defend, blah, 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 Duchamp decided to subvert what they were doing. And he did this by sending to the exhibition, which was open to anyone. Anyone could submit a work if they paid a fee to join the association and a small exhibition fee. He sent to the exhibition a urinal for submission to the sculpture section, and he did so anonymously. So the directors of the exhibition, it's like 4 or 5 days before it's supposed to open, they open up this crate and pull out a urinal submitted as an artwork. There's a big debate about this. What can we do? We're supposed to be, celebrating independent art and the freedom of the artist, etc. And here's this person who sent us a urinal. And they had a vote and decided that they would not exhibit it. And so Duchamp withdrew from the organizing committee, but he'd already arranged for a journal to be circulated at the actual exhibition called The Blind Man. And 2 issues of this journal came out during the exhibition, and in the second issue of the journal, it was devoted to this urinal. He asked another anarchist artist, a photographer, a guy called Alfred Stieglitz, to photograph the urinal. And the photograph of the urinal, the exhibition refused by the independence organizers, was reproduced in the journal, and all these debates were chronicled in the journal, attacking the people who had organized the exhibition, exposing their hypocrisy, the fact that freedom in art had its limits, was one of his purposes. But another deeper purpose, and this relates to his Stirnerist outlook, was to get out from under the received notions of what art is, to assert his own independence as an individual over and against the socially mandated notions of what an artist does and what an artwork is, etc. And so his notion of the ready-made meant, well, he said, anyone can be an artist, anyone can point to something and say that for me has aesthetic value and therefore is an artwork, right? So to some degree he was trying to radicalize, in the sense of make possible artistic expression regardless of whether someone is officially an artist or not, in the sense that, you know, the ready-made and an artwork can exist anywhere if someone conceptualizes it as an artwork and thinks of it and appreciates it in those terms. The ready-made idea also was a problem for the art system because it undermined the idea of art as a commodity. In Duchamp's time, an artwork was very much tied to notions of individual creativity and the preciousness of a unique art object. So when he suggested there are artistic aspects to a mass-produced urinal, he was suggesting that anything in the world can be appreciated as an art object. And this kind of, again, undermined the commodification system in art. He carried the politics of this kind of art into the 1950s and 60s. He continued to pronounce things to be ready-made artworks and so on. And so this discourse continued to mess up the art world into the 60s when he died. So that's an instance of Dadaism in art in the United States during World War I. I think it's fair to say that in terms of the history of art after World War I, on the left, amongst radicals, Marxism really comes to the fore, communist art really comes to the fore, people are looking to the Soviet Union, less and less artists identify as anarchists. A lot of the alternative projects that anarchists have been involved in, for example, in New York and during World War I, there was also a modern school movement, there was an alternative educational center, there was an art class at the center. A lot of people were learning how to paint, sculpt, etc. at this art class. There were debates in the anarchist journals around aesthetics and so on. That really has a low ebb in the 1920s and 30s by virtue of the preeminence of communism in the United States and Europe and so on, and globally in the radical movement. But anarchism in the arts is renewed during the late 1930s. There's an interesting renewal of anarchism in the arts tied to the resistance to World War II. And so in the United States, there are a number of artists who formed a movement called the Abstract Expressionist movement. And they paint work that has nothing to do with the world around them, really, which is all about personal expression, and strips away representation in art. They do this partly because they've seen a kind of agitational art being made under the auspices of the communist movement that quickly became a tool, for producing art that would be dictated by the communist Communist Party apparatus, and they reject that kind of art. On the other hand, they see the everyday world around them as sullied with nationalism, capitalism, etc. And they really want to carve out art making as a sphere of autonomy from capitalism, from the state, and so on. And so the solution they arrive at is to create art that's completely abstract, which is all about a direct communication of their feeling onto the canvas through brush stroke and gesture and color and so on. And so strangely, this art movement becomes popular. It gains a following in New York, in the art scene there. And so now we have work by artists in this movement like Barnett Newman or Mark Rothko in important galleries around the world. Anarchism in the arts continued to develop during the 1960s. And a number of artists are involved, particularly in the United States, in anti-war work, where they create art that's all about the resistance to the war. There's a group called the Living Theatre, which is also active in Europe during the 50s and 60s and into the 70s. Indeed, they still exist today, which is a theatre group who are doing anti-authoritarian plays and so on, and trying to use theater to, well, integrate theater into life. And so they start doing theater at protests, etc. In their theater, they do works that expose, the way in which authoritarianism saturates our everyday existence, and also work that's around prefiguring breaking out of those conditions of conformity and so on that feed into authoritarian social relations. During the Paris uprising in 1968, the Living Theatre were there, and were amongst the people that occupied the Odeon Theatre, and had this open forum of discussion around how we can realize a anti-authoritarian society here and now, and so on. And that was very much part of their theatrical work. Well, they're active through the 60s and into the 70s and 80s, as I've already said, and are participating in the renewal of anarchist values in their sphere.